Yeah. They were especially entitled to be the crew of this first supply ship. When the platform was being built, its pilot gyros had been built by a precision tool firm owned by Joe's father. He'd gone by plane with the infinitely precise apparatus to bootstrap, to deliver and install it in the platform. And the plane was sabotaged, and the gyros were ruined. They'd consumed 4 months in the building, and 4 months more for balancing with absolute no-tolerance accuracy. The platform couldn't wait so long for duplicates, so Joe had improvised a method of repair, and with Haney to devise the special machine tool setups, and with the chief to use fanatically fine workmanship, and Mike and Joe aiding according to their gifts, they'd rebuilt the apparatus in an impossibly short time. The original notion was Joe's, but he couldn't have done the job without the others. And there had been other, incidental triumphs by the team of 4. They were not the only ones who'd worked feverishly for the glory of having helped to build the Earth's first artificial moon, but they had accomplished more than most. Joe had even been appointed to be an alternate member of the platform's crew, but the man he was to have substituted for recovered from an illness, and Joe was left behind at the platform's launching. But all of them had rated some reward, and it was to serve in the small ships that would supply the man-made satellite. Now they were ready to begin. The chief grinned exuberantly as Joe ducked through the bars of the launching cage and approached the ship. He was a Mohawk Indian, one of that tribe which for 2 generations had supplied steelworkers to every bridge and dam and skyscraper job on the continent. He was brown and bulky and explosive. Haney looked tense and strained. He was tall and lean and spare, and a good man in any sort of trouble. Mike blazed excitement. Mike was 41 inches high, and he was full grown. He had worked on the platform, bucking rivets and making welds and inspections in places too small for a normal-sized man to reach. He frantically resented any concessions to his size, and he was as good a man as any. He simply was the small economy size. "Hiya, Joe," boomed the chief. "All set? Had breakfast?" Joe nodded. He began to ask anxious questions about steering rocket fuel and the launching cage release and the takeoff rockets and the reduction valve from the air tanks — he'd thought of that on the way over — and the shortwave and LORAN and radar. Haney nodded to some questions. Mike said briskly, "I checked," to others. The chief grunted amiably. "Look, Joe, we checked everything last night. We checked it again this morning. I even caught Mike polishing the ejection seats, because there wasn't anything else to make sure of." Joe managed to smile. The ejection seats were assuredly the most unlikely of all devices to be useful today. They were supposedly life-saving devices. If the ship came a cropper on takeoff, the 4 of them were supposed to use ejection seats, like those supplied to jet pilots. They would be thrown clear of the ship, and ribbon-like parachutes might open, and might let them land alive. But it wasn't likely. Joe had objected to their presence. If a feather dropped to Earth from a height of 600 miles, it would be falling so fast when it hit the atmosphere that it would heat up and burn to ashes from pure air friction. It wasn't likely that they could get out of the ship if anything went wrong. Somebody marched stiffly toward the 4 of them. Joe's expression grew rueful. The space project was neither Army nor Navy nor Air Corps, but something that so far was its own individual self. But the man marching toward Joe was Lieutenant Commander Brown, strictly Navy, assigned to the shed as an observer. And there were some times when he baffled Joe, like now. He halted and looked as if he expected Joe to salute. Joe didn't. Lieutenant Commander Brown said formally, "I would like to offer my best wishes for your trip, Mr. Kenmore." "Thanks," said Joe. Brown smiled distantly. "You understand, of course, that I consider navigation essentially a naval function, and it does seem to me that any ship, including a spaceship, should be manned by naval personnel. But I assuredly wish you good fortune." "Thanks," said Joe again. Brown shook hands, then stalked off. Haney rumbled in his throat. "How come, Joe, he doesn't wish all of us good luck?" "He does," said Joe, "but his mind's in uniform, too. He's been trained that way. I'd like to make a bet that we have him as a passenger out to the platform some day." "Heaven forbid," growled Haney. There was an outrageous tumult outside the wide-open gap in the shed's wall. Something went shrieking by the doorway. It looked like a magnified top half of a loaf of baker's bread, painted gray and equipped with an air scoop in front and a plastic bubble for a pilot. It howled like a lost baby dragon, its flat underside tilted up and up until it was almost vertical. It had no wings, but a blue-white flame spurted out of its rear, wobbling from side to side for reasons best known to itself. It was a push-pot, which could not possibly be called a jet plane because it could not possibly fly. Only it did. It settled down on its flame-spouting tail, and the sparse vegetation burst into smoky flame and shriveled, and the thing, still shrieking like a fog-horn in a tunnel, flopped flat forward with a resounding clank. It was abruptly silent. But the total noise was not lessened. Another push-pot came soaring wildly into view, making hysterical outcries. It touched and banged violently to earth. Others appeared in the air beyond the construction shed. One flopped so hard on landing that its tail rose in the air and it attempted a somersault. It made 10 times more noise than before, the flame from its tail making wild gyrations, and flopped back again with a crash. 2 others rolled over on their sides after touching ground. One ended up on its back like a tumblebug, wriggling. They seemed to land by hundreds, but their number was actually in dozens. It was not until the last one was down that Joe could make himself heard. The push-pots were jet motors in frames and metal skin, with built-in JATO rocket tubes beside their engines. On the ground they were quite helpless. In the air they were unbelievably clumsy. They were actually balanced and steered by vanes in the blasts of their jets, and they combined the absolute maximum of sheer thrust with the irreducible minimum of flyability. Crane trucks went out to pick them up. Joe said anxiously, "We'd better check our flight plan again. We have to know it absolutely." He headed across the floor to the flight data board. He passed the hull of another ship like his own, which was near completion, and the bare skeletons of 2 others which needed a lot of work yet. They'd been begun at distant plants and then hauled here on monstrous trailers for completion. The wooden mock-up of the design for all the ships, in which every possible arrangement of instruments and machinery had been tested out, lay neglected by the shed wall. The 4 stood before the flight data board. It listed the readings every instrument should show during every instant of the flight. The readings had been calculated with infinite care, and Joe and the others needed to know them rather better than they knew their multiplication tables. Once they started out, they wouldn't have time to wonder if everything was right for the time and place. They needed to know. They stood there, soaking up the information the board contained, forming mental pictures of it, making as sure as possible that any one of them would spot anything wrong the instant it showed up, and would instantly know what had to be done about it. A gigantic crane truck came in through the wide doorway. It dangled a push-pot. It rolled over to the launching cage in which the spaceship lay and set the unwieldy metal object against that cage. There was a clank as the push-pot caught hold of the magnetic grapples. The crane went out again.